April 1945. The war in Europe is breathing its final, ragged breaths. In a gray courtyard outside a requisition school near Frankfurt, captured German officers, some still wearing fragments of their shattered pride, are being processed by American military police. Among them stand several women, auxiliaries from the Luftwaffe, nurses, clerks from the Wehrmacht's female branches. Their uniforms are neat but hollow, their faces pale from exhaustion and disbelief. Then, through the drizzle, a line of American vehicles rolls in. From the lead truck step, women in olive drab uniforms, trim, purposeful, shoulders squared beneath the insignia of the U.S. Army, members of the Women's Army Corps, the WAC. They move with calm precision, directing transport, checking manifests, assisting wounded GIs with the same authority as any officer. The German women freeze. Their eyes follow every step, every gesture. No man commands these Americans. They are the command. And something inside the German ranks cracks. One officer, her cap trembling in her hand, begins to weep silently, because what she sees is not only defeat, but the impossible. A world where women wear power openly. A world her empire swore could never exist. Before that moment in the courtyard, before the tears, before the silence of surrender, the world had already been divided by two visions of what women could be. In Nazi Germany, womanhood was never just biology. It was ideology. The regime of Adolf Hitler saw every woman as an instrument of the nation's bloodline, a vessel of race, not of rank. From the earliest days of the Reich, propaganda had hammered the slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. To the Nazi state, a woman's duty was not to lead armies or build machines, but to bear sons who would. In 1933, when Hitler came to power, the newly formed National Socialist Women's League stripped away the professional rights that German women had fought for during the Weimar Republic. Female doctors, lawyers, professors, forced from positions of influence. University admissions for women were cut to a fraction. The state wanted mothers, not thinkers. By the late 1930s, the ideal German woman had become a uniformed symbol of obedience, blonde, fertile, patriotic. She might wear a uniform, but only as a nurse, a secretary, or a signal operator, never as a soldier. Even as the Reich armed itself for conquest, it refused to arm half its population. Yet war, in its brutal logic, doesn't care for ideology. When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, the German war machine expanded faster than its manpower could sustain. Millions of men were sent to the front, leaving an empire that needed to function. Factories, hospitals, communications, logistics. By 1943, necessity forced the Reich to create female auxiliaries in every branch of service, the Helferinnen, helpers. Over 500,000 women would wear those auxiliary uniforms. But they were not permitted to carry weapons, not allowed to command men, not even to sign documents of authority. They transmitted orders, typed reports, coded signals, bandaged wounds, but their identity remained bound by subservience. Their uniforms looked military, but their status was not. Behind the front, they witnessed the machine of total war consuming their nation. In Berlin, the air raid wardens were mostly women. The anti-aircraft batteries, manned increasingly by teenage girls. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's communications network was run largely by women, some barely out of school. And yet, the propaganda never changed. Even as women served and died in bombed-out command posts, Nazi broadcasts spoke of sacrifice, not service. No medals of valor were issued for women in combat roles because, officially, there were none. This was the contradiction of the Third Reich, a regime that worshipped strength but feared female power. Across the Atlantic, another vision was taking shape. In 1942, when the United States entered the war, the U.S. Army faced a logistical crisis of its own. Millions of men were drafted, leaving essential military support roles unfilled. General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, proposed something radical: enlist women, not as nurses, but as soldiers in non-combat roles. It was an experiment born of pragmatism, but it would redefine military culture. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAAC, was formed in May 1942 later converted to full military status as the Women's Army Corps, WAC, in 1943. For the first time in American history, women wore the same uniform, took the same oath, and served under the same command structure as men. They were given ranks, pay, and, eventually, the right to be saluted. By the war's end, over 150,000 women had served in the WAC alone. Thousands more joined the Waves in the Navy, the Spars in the Coast Guard, and the WASP pilots who ferried bombers and fighters across oceans. They decoded messages, repaired tanks, trained gunners, and operated radar stations. They worked in intelligence, weather analysis, communications, logistics, and administration. Entire operations turned on their precision and discipline. Unlike in Germany, where uniforms disguise subordination, the American women's uniforms became a declaration. We serve as equals in purpose. Their presence transformed the very look of the Allied war effort. Photographs from London, Algiers, and Normandy show rows of women officers beside male commanders, typing orders, analyzing reconnaissance, briefing pilots. They were not decoration. They were part of command, and they carried themselves that way. It wasn't just what they did, it was how they looked doing it. Smart olive jackets, rank insignia glinting, side caps angled with quiet confidence. They were visible proof that democracy, unlike dictatorship, could adapt, that strength could coexist with equality. As these women moved through Europe behind the advancing Allied lines, their presence was revolutionary to those who watched them, especially to those raised in a world where obedience had been virtue. When American female officers entered Germany with the occupation forces, many of the captured German auxiliaries stared in disbelief. For years, Nazi propaganda had mocked the idea of militarized American women as grotesque, an insult to femininity. Yet now, before their eyes, those same women represented the victorious army that had crushed the Reich. The contrast was unbearable to some. For the German women, the sight was not only humiliation, it was revelation. The war that had begun with visions of racial and gender superiority ended with the shattering proof that power and intelligence were not bound by gender, and in that reversal, in that single encounter in a rain-soaked courtyard, the tears of one German officer told a story larger than the fall of a nation. It was the collapse of an entire belief system, and from its ruins, a new order of women was stepping forward, wearing the uniform of freedom. The image of those two uniforms, gray and olive, was more than coincidence. It was collision. Two worlds meeting under the weight of defeat. Two ideas of womanhood staring each other down across the ashes of Europe. For the German women, the end of the war was not just loss. It was awakening. They had grown up under the strictest form of state control, raised on Hitler Youth oaths, taught that the highest female duty was motherhood for the Führer. Many had volunteered for auxiliary service, not from political zeal, but from a desire to be useful, to feel part of something larger than themselves. They had worked through endless nights in communications bunkers, deciphering orders, hearing screams through static, feeling the war close in around them. When they were finally captured, they expected punishment or pity. What they did not expect was equality. The American women who stood before them did not avert their eyes. They gave commands, carried clipboards, managed logistics. Some even interrogated prisoners. To the Germans, this inversion of roles felt impossible. In their world, women were never permitted to command men. Here, American women did it with calm authority, without apology, without arrogance. Witnesses from Allied units later recalled German auxiliaries breaking down, not from fear, but from shame and disbelief. Their tears weren't for the Reich. They were for the realization that they had been lied to all their lives. That moment in the courtyard wasn't just cultural, it was emotional collapse. The image of the confident, capable American woman stood as silent. Indictment of every restriction the Nazi state had imposed. The battlefield had shifted from tanks and guns to symbols, and the symbols were devastating. Behind the emotions lay a cold, strategic truth. The inclusion of women in the American war machine was not a moral gesture, it was a tactical revolution. The Allied victory was, in part, a victory of logistics, and logistics required minds, precision, endurance, qualities that the U.S. discovered in abundance among its women. At the height of the war, WACs operated teletype centers that transmitted millions of coded messages a week. They worked in cipher rooms at Bletchley Park, in Pentagon war rooms, in field headquarters across North Africa and Europe. They were the nervous system of the Allied advance. In the Signal Corps, female operators maintained 24-hour communications with advancing units. In intelligence, others processed aerial photographs that determined where the next bombing raid would fall. They coordinated supply routes stretching from Normandy beaches to the Rhine. To the Germans, who had dismissed women's capability in all such fields, this was unthinkable. The Reich had bled its manpower dry while leaving half its population underused. Even as German cities burned, its ideology forbade women from taking up meaningful command or technical responsibility. The result was catastrophic inefficiency. Meanwhile, in the Allied ranks, efficiency was everything. A WAC typist in Algiers might process the order that sent an entire armored division forward. A waves officer in Washington might decode a message that saved a convoy in the Atlantic. Technology had made war more complex than ever before, and women were the ones who mastered its rhythm. So when captured German auxiliaries saw these women commanding equipment, vehicles, and men, they were witnessing not just a social shock, but a technological one, the very system that had believed in racial and gender. Superiority was being defeated by a system that believed in competence. General Eisenhower once said of the WACs, "They replace men so that more men can go into combat." But his private memos said something deeper. He trusted them completely. In every theater of the war, commanders discovered that female staff brought a level of order and precision unmatched in the chaos of wartime bureaucracy. They demanded less comfort, worked longer hours, and kept morale stable even as the war dragged into its bloodiest phases. American women officers did not only fill roles, they reshaped the culture around them. In field hospitals, they led triage units that saved thousands. In command posts, they managed schedules, reports, and logistics with a calm that held entire operations together. To Eisenhower and Marshall, this wasn't an experiment anymore. It was evolution. They understood that a modern army could not function without female discipline at its core. Meanwhile, in Germany, the leadership's refusal to adapt drained morale. Hitler's contempt for women's leadership left his regime brittle. Even in the final days, when Berlin was burning and Soviet forces closed in, he refused calls to formally arm or command women, calling it unnatural. That stubbornness became symbolic of the entire Nazi downfall, an inability to evolve. So when American women officers entered captured towns, their presence carried psychological weight far beyond their numbers. For soldiers and civilians alike, they embodied the discipline of democracy, the quiet, unyielding efficiency of a free army. And for those German auxiliaries watching, it felt like looking into the future. The Nazis had weaponized ideology. The Allies weaponized truth. Throughout the war, German propaganda portrayed Allied women as unnatural or masculine, evidence, they claimed, of a decaying society. Posters mocked them as unfeminine soldiers in lipstick and trousers, claiming that such women were the downfall of civilization. But propaganda collapses the moment it meets reality. In 1944 and 1945, as American and British female personnel entered liberated France, Belgium, and Germany, civilians saw for themselves women who were competent, composed, and respected by men. It undermined years of Nazi messaging overnight. German prisoners, male and female, often spoke later of their astonishment at how American officers, men, addressed their female colleagues as equals. No mockery, no hierarchy based on gender. Orders were followed because of rank, not sex. That was the quiet moral revolution of the Allied armies. Hierarchy without humiliation. When the German women wept, it wasn't simply envy. It was mourning. Mourning the years wasted under an ideology that told them their worth ended at obedience. For some, those tears were the first act of liberation. Because in that moment, they understood that the enemy's victory wasn't just military, it was moral. The world that would rise after 1945 would not belong to empires of blood, but to societies willing to see every mind as a weapon. And among the ruins of that revelation, The tears of German women marked the birth of something the Old World could never imagine. Equality forged in the fire of war. April 1945. The Third Reich was dying. Berlin burned. Columns of refugees stumbled through roads lined with corpses and craters. Allied bombers darkened the skies. Every radio broadcast from Goebbels promised final victory. But even the most loyal citizens now whispered the truth. It was over. And amid the chaos, a quiet reckoning unfolded in the very heart of the Reich's ideology. In Allied prison camps, as the Wehrmacht surrendered by the tens of thousands, hundreds of female auxiliaries were captured, radio operators, medics, administrative officers. Most were young. Some had never even seen a battlefield until the end arrived at their doorstep. At one such processing site near Wiesbaden, American officers recorded a scene later described in dispatches. A group of captured German Helferinnen stood lined against a wall as trucks unloaded WAC units for post-surrender coordination. The Germans watched in silence. The American women stepped out, confident, efficient, armed with maps and orders. They moved among male soldiers as equals, issuing instructions without hesitation. One German interpreter later recalled a Luftwaffe secretary whispering, "They treat them like men." Another, barely 20, turned away and cried. In that instant, decades of indoctrination crumbled. These women had been told their destiny was submission, to husbands, to the Führer, to the state. Now, standing face to face with the victors, they saw a vision their own nation had forbidden them. Women not as background, but as force. For the American WACs, this moment barely registered. They were too busy performing their duty. For the German officers, it was unbearable truth. They were not just defeated by superior firepower. They were defeated by an idea. The humiliation was not just military, it was existential. Every insignia on the American women's sleeves represented a freedom the Reich had denied its own daughters. Every salute given to a female officer was a mirror held to their own subjugation. And in that mirror, many saw themselves not as victims of war, but of belief. In the ruins of Berlin, similar scenes unfolded. Soviet troops, brutal and vengeful, stormed the city. But it was the arrival of Western Allied units in other regions that brought a subtler kind of shock. In captured command centers, German women officers saw American women interrogators from the Women's Army Corps working alongside intelligence officers from the OSS. They translated documents, questioned prisoners, and made critical assessments that shaped post-war operations. It was not an act of domination. It was the normalization of equality. One report from U.S. Army psychological warfare teams noted that captured German women displayed visible confusion and emotional distress when confronted by female Allied personnel of authority. These were not isolated reactions. They reflected the collapse of a cultural system. The Nazi ideology had claimed absolute control over gender roles, men as warriors, women as mothers. But in the final months of the war, the German army itself had betrayed that ideal. Teenage girls had been handed Panzerfausts in Berlin's ruins. Secretaries had been forced to operate anti-aircraft guns. The very thing the Reich had called unnatural, women in combat, had become a necessity for survival. And yet, even then, it refused to name them soldiers. The Americans, on the other hand, had accepted that necessity years earlier, not as desperation, but as evolution. By 1945, the WACs were embedded in every theater, commanding logistics and intelligence with recognized authority. This contrast was more than cultural. It was moral mathematics. The system that enslaved its women had exhausted itself. The system that empowered them had adapted and endured. When German auxiliaries saw American women directing occupation logistics, they were witnessing not just the conqueror's discipline, but the shape of the future. They realized that their nation's defeat was not a tragedy of luck, but of belief. There are testimonies, rare, but recorded in Allied intelligence reports, of German female officers expressing admiration for their American counterparts. One POW was noted as saying, "If our women had been treated like that, perhaps we would not have lost." It wasn't a military calculation. It was psychological surrender. This recognition spread silently across the shattered empire. In hospitals, camps, and destroyed cities, women who had been told they were only worthy as mothers now found themselves rebuilding homes, burying the dead, feeding families, negotiating with occupation forces. They began to discover that survival itself was an act of power. The sight of American female officers became an emblem of this awakening. In those brief, wordless exchanges between captor and captive, history pivoted. For centuries, power had been worn as a man's uniform. Now, in the mud of a broken continent, it had changed shoulders. For the Americans, this was victory. For the Germans, revelation. For the world, transformation. The ideological war was over, but its moral aftershocks were just beginning. The surrender of Germany was not a single moment. It was a slow unraveling of illusions. Even after the guns fell silent, the war of beliefs continued. In every occupied city, Hamburg, Cologne, Munich, the same sight repeated itself. Columns of weary Wehrmacht men marching past Allied patrols, their heads bowed, while among the victors moved women in uniform. They carried maps, cameras, radios, and paperwork that would rebuild Europe from ashes. It was not spectacle. It was statement. To the conquered Germans, these women became living contradictions of everything they had been taught. The Nazi propaganda that once mocked degenerate democracies now lay exposed as fraud. The supposed weakness of liberal societies had instead produced the most powerful military coalition in human history, one that could harness every citizen's ability, regardless of gender. In Frankfurt, American WAC officers supervised logistical headquarters that processed millions of displaced persons. They spoke with authority to male subordinates, issued orders to engineers and quartermasters, and coordinated the flow of food and medicine across occupied zones. Each act of organization was a quiet revolution. The defeated German officers, male and female alike, saw in these women something alien to their culture: legitimacy. Their authority was not borrowed from husbands or fathers. It came from competence and law. When they gave an order, soldiers obeyed not because of gender, but because it was correct. That idea, obedience to logic rather than ideology, was perhaps the greatest threat to the totalitarian mind. American women, in that brief occupation period, represented more than victory. They embodied a civilization where merit replaced myth, where service, not subservience, defined identity. The Germans had worshipped symbols. The Americans created systems. And in those systems, equality found its first functional home. The year 1945 marked not only the end of the war, but the beginning of a moral inversion. For the Nazi state, womanhood had been sacred but shackled, a vessel for purity. For the Democratic Allies, womanhood became dynamic, a vessel for purpose. This was not feminism as politics. It was feminism as inevitability. In the ruins of Europe, where starvation and ruin blurred all boundaries, capability became the only currency of survival. The American women in uniform proved, without speeches, without manifestos, that civilization could no longer afford to waste half its potential. The symbolic contrast between the American WAC and the German Helferin became the first battle of post-war gender ideology. It told every observer, power no longer belonged to ideology, it belonged to efficiency, intelligence, and adaptability. The world was watching. From occupied Germany to neutral Switzerland, from Soviet-ruled Poland to liberated France, reports and photographs of women in uniform circulated widely. Newspapers carried images of American WACs inspecting Nazi archives, typing in command posts, briefing officers. To many European women, these photographs were more powerful than any propaganda film. They were proof that progress had a uniform. The most striking accounts come from the POW camps where captured German women interacted daily with their American counterparts. A Red Cross nurse later wrote, "Some of them cried quietly, not from cruelty, but from recognition. They looked at our girls, strong, confident, and they understood. They had been serving the wrong cause, the wrong men, the wrong idea of what a woman was supposed to be." That recognition would outlive the war itself. Many of those German auxiliaries, once released, would go on to join reconstruction efforts, social welfare programs, and education reform movements in West Germany. Some credited their first vision of freedom to that moment of confrontation, the day they saw American women command respect without needing permission. It was a psychological detonation more enduring than any bomb. When the dust of war settled, it was clear that something irreversible had shifted. The old Europe, built on hierarchy, obedience, and myth, had fallen. In its place rose a world where even the smallest act of equality carried the force of destiny, and it had begun, quietly, in the eyes of a captured officer, watching another woman walk past in uniform, unafraid. The war ended in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. Cities lay hollowed out. Roads became rivers of rubble. In Germany, the Reich that had once promised 1,000 years of triumph had burned itself to ash in 12. And amid that ash stood the survivors, men without cause, children without fathers, and women who no longer recognized the world they had been told to serve. For millions of German women, the first months after surrender were not liberation, they were reckoning. The collapse of the Nazi system stripped away everything familiar: structure, belief, certainty. Yet it also opened a void in which new possibilities could take root. The American occupation authorities quickly realized that rebuilding Germany meant rebuilding its people, and that women would be central to that process. Female auxiliaries, once sworn to Hitler, were now recruited into local administration under Allied supervision. They translated, filed reports, distributed food, ran hospitals. In the ruins of their ideology, they discovered a paradox. The freedom to act had come only through defeat. For many, that freedom felt both fragile and frightening. They had been taught obedience. Now they were being asked to think, decide, rebuild. In those same offices and barracks where American women worked beside them, an unspoken exchange took place. The German women watched and learned, not through lectures but through example. They saw American WAC officers speak directly to male superiors without deference, joke with soldiers, correct errors, and manage systems with professional ease. The sight was disorienting at first, then quietly inspiring. By 1946, sociologists studying the occupation zones noted an observable change in German attitudes toward gender. The rigidity of the Nazi era began to dissolve under the influence of contact with Allied personnel, especially Americans. Newspapers featured stories of the women of the U.S. Army who had driven trucks through France, decoded messages in England, and managed supply depots across Europe. For young German girls growing up amid ruins, these stories became myths of a different kind, not of blood or destiny, but of possibility. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American women who had marched through Europe returned home to a nation unsure how to treat them. The whacks and waves were praised, decorated, photographed, and then quietly told to step aside. The war was over. The men were coming home. Most of the women's units were disbanded. Uniforms were folded away, medals tucked into drawers. Yet something irreversible had changed within them. They had seen the front lines of power, and they could not unsee it. Many struggled with the return to domestic life. Former WACs found themselves confined again to typing pools, nursing jobs, or marriage. But others carried their wartime discipline into civilian careers: politics, education, science, government. Their quiet insistence on equality seeded the next generation's movement. The military, too, would never be the same. The efficiency demonstrated by female personnel during the war had been too evident to ignore. Reports from generals and officers repeatedly described the WACs as indispensable. By 1948, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, granting women permanent status in the U.S. military. What began as an experiment of necessity had become a pillar of national policy. The symbolism of that shift rippled outward. In Britain, the ATS and WRNS programs evolved into lasting institutions. In France, resistance heroines like Lucie Aubrac and André Borel inspired a generation of women to demand public roles. Even in the Soviet Union, where female snipers and pilots had fought and bled, the Western visibility of American servicewomen gave legitimacy to global conversations about women's equality. And in Germany itself, the psychological aftershocks endured for decades. The same nation that once worshipped the ideal of the submissive mother now faced a new identity crisis. Under Allied guidance, West Germany rebuilt itself as a democracy, and within that framework, women began reclaiming agency. Former Helferinnen became teachers, journalists, and administrators. The word Gleichberechtigung, equality, entered political discourse. The tears shed in that courtyard in 1945 had not been wasted. They had watered the soil of transformation. For the American women, the victory was quieter, but no less profound. They had proven that patriotism required neither gender nor permission. In every military base, every liberated town, their presence had contradicted the old order. They had shown that leadership could have grace, that authority could wear compassion, that discipline could coexist with empathy. In post-war interviews, many WAC veterans spoke not of triumph, but of duty. They had not sought to change the world. They had only wanted to serve it. Yet history rarely consults intention. Their service had become proof that capability knows no gender, and that courage takes many forms. When they walked away from Europe, they left more than supply depots and command posts behind. They left an image, a silhouette in olive drab, standing straight beneath the ruins of tyranny. To those who saw it, that image meant something greater than victory. It meant permission, the quiet permission to dream beyond tradition. In the following decades, as Cold War tension replaced wartime unity, that legacy endured. The U.S. military slowly expanded roles for women in administration, intelligence, and later, combat support. Each new generation traced its lineage back to those wartime pioneers who had proved that equality was not theory, but practice. For Germany, the transformation was slower but deeper. By the 1950s, the daughters of those weeping officers were enrolling in universities. By the 1970s, they were marching for rights that their mothers had never dared to imagine. And in 2001, when the Bundeswehr finally opened all combat roles to women, a quiet circle closed, a circle that began with disbelief and tears in 1945. History has many victories. Some are loud, marked by banners and parades. Others are silent, sealed in the memory of a single glance, a single moment when a defeated ideology recognizes the truth it cannot destroy. The day those German women saw American women in uniform was one of those moments. It did not end with surrender. It began there, because the real victory of 1945 was not only military, it was moral. And its battlefield was not the skies of Berlin or the beaches of Normandy. It was the human heart, where the old world ended and the new one quietly began. In the end, wars are remembered not only for the cities they destroy, but for the illusions they expose. The Second World War had torn apart the physical world, but beneath the ruins, it had also torn open the human mind. When those German officers wept, it was not from humiliation alone. It was the grief of awakening. For years they had lived inside a myth that strength belonged to men and that loyalty required silence. In that single moment, they saw the myth collapse. Before them stood proof that power could be disciplined, intelligent, and female, and that freedom itself required equality to survive. History often hides its revolutions behind uniforms. The olive drab of the Women's Army Corps looked no different from any other, but within it marched the beginning of something entirely new. Those women carried not just orders, but the weight of transformation. Their quiet footsteps echoed louder than any speech, because they showed the world that democracy's strength lay not in who ruled, but in who was allowed to serve. For the German women who watched, that realization was both wound and cure. Their tears were not defeat, they were baptism. Out of the ruins of a false empire, they glimpsed the truth of another, that dignity is not given by men, nor measured by uniforms, but earned in the courage to act. The war ended in 1945, but its moral victory, the liberation of the human spirit from the chains of ideology, began in moments like that courtyard. One empire fell, one idea rose, and the world quietly began to change forever.